going. Okay.
Should I take my glasses off? It doesn't matter.
No,
Okay. Okay.
So I start the process by asking every artist to say their name
Uh-huh.
and let me know where we are located right now.
Okay. My name is Thomas Allen Harris, and we are in Harlem on 131st Street in my production studio.
Thank you. So, Thomas, it's such a pleasure to be able to sit down and have this conversation with you because I feel like peripherally around your work for a really long time, you know, and have a familiarity with it because I've been around it. But this opportunity to sit down and actually talk to you about your process, I think is really great for me and for our audience. So you're a filmmaker, and I'd like for you to begin by speaking about how you came to be a filmmaker.
How I came to be a filmmaker.
Yeah.
You want the short version or the long version?
The semi-long version.
Okay. Okay. Well, I was. Well, I should say first of all that I grew up partly in East Africa, in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam. I went to junior high school there with my mother and my brother, and that was really formative in my my evolution as a person and as a citizen of the world. I came back to this country and was really, I felt like I felt a certain ambivalence around the way in which my communication skills after living there with regards to English and writing, and gravitated to the sciences and went to Bronx High School of Science and then later went to Harvard and was pre-med and majored in biology and honors and was 1 foot away from medical school. I'd taken my MCATs when I finally started writing and wrote a grant that actually got me to Europe. And my goal was to look at immigrant communities living in various European countries from the Caribbean and also from Africa, but principally from the Caribbean. And I went there and I started using film as a way of really kind of allowing myself to be immersed in the language, you know, from a kind of more poetic perspective. You know, speaking on in the streets of, you know, in Holland or France or Italy, and principally Holland and France. But and I fell in love with film, and I had taken right before I left Harvard a photography course, a series of photography classes, and a writing class. And it just seemed, and I actually went to Europe with a portfolio, and I ended up working as an assistant photographer and also a stylist. And one of the people I work with is Patrick Kelly, who's was a well-known designer, is a well-known designer. He's dead, but his work lives on. And I came back to this country after meeting Ellis Hazlip, who was a producer in Seoul. And I came back and applied to film school. And when I came back, I got a job working in television. And at the time, I got into NYU Film School, but I was thinking, you know, I just felt really ambivalent because I was an, you know, out African diasporic citizen, and I was like, well, who's my audience? You know, it was in the mid '80s, you know, and to be, you know, be out, you know, black gay man, you know, and and I was, and so I had to kind of like figure out, well, where I had to create my audience,
Right.
you know, and so I think that in some ways my work is about creating audience, and you know, this is before Marlon Riggs, who was really important to my development, and Isaac Julian, and you know, of course Camille Billups is, you know, in terms of the way in which she started fashioning autobiography in her work and autobiographical journeys. And so I think really early on, I was thinking about how one performs the self, and the creative process, and fashioning an identity, and the elasticity around that, you know, because I was just so much aware of, like, you know, having to, you know, not fitting into certain ways of, you projections, whether they were like what is an African American, or what is a black person, or what is same gender loving person, and wanting to like bring together a lot of those particular communities, but also the communities I grew up with as well, because I come from a family of activists. My father was a South African freedom fighter for the ANC, and he was in exile for 30 years. So I grew up in exile in a house, because if one person in the family is in exile, the rest of the family is in exile.
That's right.
So I didn't realize that until much later. But, and then my mother was very much involved, first in the ANC and then in the Women for Racial and Economic Equality. So she was an activist, throughout my entire life. And her parents had also been activists, at least my grandfather. And I'm actually, so I think that the idea of the kind of the art and activism, and then later I became a journalist. My first job was in journalism. My first real job. I produced for the 11th Hour and 13 Live, and so I was actually a journalist, but I was actually bringing in a lot of people who were not the normal experts in terms of to have discussions together. So I did the first Day Without Art in 1990 with it was either 1991 with. On public television, and also did the first gay and lesbian town hall meeting between New York and San Francisco at the same time, working for the 11th Hour and then 13 Live, and did a lot of work around AIDS and HIV and bringing together, people who were activists around, HIV, and then women talking about the war, and so and bringing lots of different classes and people, and did a piece with David Wojnarowicz, and so we became friends during a period, and that piece actually got nixed, but part of it survived, and it was also starting to do activism within public television to open things up, and in a critical way, but not antagonistic, I hope. And then in '91 I got accepted I applied, and it was accepted to the Whitney Independent Study Program in the theory, critical studies, and started working with folks there, and also Mancha Diawara. And I produced my first experimental short film, which is called Splash, and that made a big splash. And it was a big thing in the Black popular culture kind of conference that took place in New York, so that began my career, in terms of, or my work as an artist working within. I consider myself an artist working within the documentary form. And so the first long-form documentary that I produced is called Vintage Families of Value. And that began when someone close to me tested HIV positive, and I did not think that, at that time we thought there was death sentence. And so I decided to make a film about siblings who, gay and lesbian siblings. That kind of triggered me to make a film and to look at my relationship with my brother. And but I was also interested in making a film that wasn't just about my brother and myself and our dialogue. Why you have these two, brothers, both of whom were, same gender loving, both of whom are artists, and I was also thinking that I wanted to include other sets of siblings, because at that time there was this, constant this pre-marriage, pre-queer marriage thing, same-sex marriage, and so gays and lesbians were being posited as something opposite to family, or to affirm one's identity, one has to leave the family. But we were deeply rooted in our family, so I wanted to find other siblings that were also same-gender loving, who were also rooted in their family and were changing their family, and their family was changing them, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. And so I got two, a brother and sister, and then three sisters. different families. And so we began a journey together. And I basically handed them the camera and asked them to interview one another over the course of 5 years. And I did the same with my brother. And what came out was this film that's this kind of like mosaic about Black family communication. And once I gave the camera to them, I realized, and this is all pre reality TV, you know, and but once I gave the camera to them, I realized that the dynamic shifted.
How so?
Well, you know, if I have the camera and I'm pointing it to you, I have the power. You know, if you have it and you're pointing it to me, you know, you get to frame who I am and also edit, you know, what I say to make it fit within your narrative, you know, or narrative, your perceived narrative of me, you know. So, so that power, by handing it from one to the other, shifts the power that's already in place because of families. You know, whether it has to do with, you know, the older sibling having a certain kind of, you know, lockdown on the younger sibling, or the younger sibling, you know, having a guilt lockdown on the older sibling, whatever. You know, everything shifted up, shakes it up. So we were able to actually, you know, create something that is this, you know, both kind of a document, kind of a poetic document, but it was also healing to the families involved in the process.
Well, that notion of wanting to shift power through your medium, using film, sounds to me a theme that continues to run through in your work, you know, throughout every project that you take. And I wonder why something like that is important for you with this medium.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's, I don't know if I would, it shift power or empower. Right. You know? Right.
I think the terms are related.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are relatable terms.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think that, like, you know, like I'm thinking of, like, particularly as African Americans, we are, we tend to be marginalized. You know, we're African diasporic people in terms of there's a grand narrative, and our narratives are like, you know, somewhere located beyond the entrails. You know, it's just like, you know, a burp. You know, if that. You know, and possibly a silent one. And so, you know, one of the things I didn't say earlier was that, along with the activism, was this intense, almost to the point of obsession, documentation of our family. So that, you know, I have thousands and thousands of images of our family, you know, on still images, but also video and Super 8. And with each project I've done, more is revealed. So I keep saying, well, that's the last family project I'm going to do. And then I do another one, and then yes, and then more stuff comes up. And then I just wanted to say that, you know, so as I do these projects, I travel across the world with them, whether it's Korea or Haiti, South Africa, Ghana, you know, all over Europe, New Zealand, South America. People come up to me and they say, you know, I have these family photographs, and I want to do something creative with them. And so, and they on the one hand they say that, and that has, you know, that had a direct impact in terms of the project's digital diaspora. On the other hand, people say, your film's cousin the viewer. And I guess it's a desire to recognize, you know, our bond. You know, that, and part of the empowerment is just recognizing that, you know, like one of my films is Amy Akata, that's my face. I see my face in your face, or I see my face in your face, you know? And to you know, and that's also that kind of notion of the, and I don't know if it's, I don't think it's really mirroring, it's really a kind of, it's not mirroring, it's an invitation to be present, to to how do I even say that? To acknowledge our shared humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what is inside the films. Mm-hmm. You know, that desire. I mean, and also a desire to, like, you know, somehow uplift. Mm-hmm. You know, whether it's through, like, you know, the joy that's inside. Mm-hmm. You know, like, I grew up in a family, like, my family didn't have that much money, you know, even though we were middle class educationally, you know. But, like, you know, looking back at these photographs, you see all the times of laughter, you know, and how, and you know, people paying for that in Japan, you know. Right. It's a commodity. And so, and that's like, you know, and I just feel like within, you know, like generationally, like in this country, particularly African Americans have had to recreate the wheel. And why have we had to recreate the wheel? Right. And so, in some ways, my work is, okay, can I connect intergenerationally in terms of the story, so that we could actually learn not simply from the parents and grandparents, but the great-grandparents and beyond, right. But also learn from the juxtaposition of, you know, African American in the United States and African American in Brazil, right. You know, right. And so that, or African American in Africa, that's or right. Europe, or African diasporic, or Afro-European, or you know, and that you know, that is really important to me, because that was also something that I thought would early in my career limit my audience, you know, because that's who I am. Right.
Well, you know, I'm really interested in you said something earlier that really kind of sparked my interest, and that was that you're an artist working within the medium of documentary, right? And I want to talk a bit more about that, because that makes me really interested in your methodology as a maker of documentary, as a maker of film. Because you speak of many influences. You know, you speak about Camille Billups. You talk about the African diaspora, your family, activism. You know, all these.
Deborah Willis.
Deborah Willis. All these things that are circling around you, that you are able to, you know, use as resources for developing your own style. So I like to hear you talk about how you come to being able to distinguish yourself as an artist who uses documentary, and why you make that distinction.
Well, I think that each film has its own form. Like, you know, the content determines the form. So with Vintage Families of Value, it was really about giving the camera, like, also, you know, over to these different sibling groups, so leveling the field, and I was also one of the sibling groups. Right. You know, of course, I also edited, but I was, you know, I gave them cuts, and so I got their feedback and took their feedback most of the time.
I know how that is.
So, and with Amy Akata, you know, and I couldn't take, you know, and that film for me was about breaking with a journalistic past, you know, with like a PBS kind of traditional documentary, because I couldn't make one using that form. Right. It was all these different perspectives. I also asked people to, you know, craft certain types of scenes that they performed in, so they actually were performing. So there's a performance element outside of their relationship with their families.
Do they know they're performing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because they wrote the scenes, and they dressed up, and they were in specific environments, and yes, so it was absolute performance. And then with and you know, it's stretched. Some were more like, you know, I mean, it's also informed by like a kind of queer aesthetic, you know, like, you know, ideas around drag and stuff, you know, and yeah, camp. And then with Amy Akata, because I had so much talking in my first film, I said, I'm going to make a film that doesn't have, I'm going to make a documentary film without recording a single word. And so I went to Brazil with 2 Super 8 cameras and made a documentary there. And it ended up I mean, the amazing thing about that film was that that film led me to find the Super 8 that my grandfather shot of the family as we went from being, colored and Negro to being Afro-American, African-American, and I would not have looked for that footage, and that was also shot in Super 8, so it became a Super 8 feature, but the trip to Brazil and shooting, led to this discovery, and so I was able, and then I reconstructed sounds with, people performing, but they were kind of reconstructed narratives based on the memory that I had of real events. Or I had samples of an interview that I did, and I would sample things that had nothing to do with the film. Right. But it was an interview with the character. Sorry, it is one hot summer day. For the record.
Not my intensity.
Well, it's also that. It's intense up in here, and it's hot. And then with 12 Disciples and Nelson Mandela, I had a very contentious relationship with my stepfather, who's the principal subject of the film. But even when we would fight, I would go down and look at the images of home, quote unquote, and imagine what it was like. And so when I had the opportunity to make this film, when I was compelled to make this film about him and the 11 other men he left South Africa with, and the people around them who supported them and who were their teachers as well, I used the photographs. I said I'm not just going to make a historical documentary film. I want to make something that leaves a lasting legacy with young people in South Africa. These guys had left 30 years before. They thought they were going to leave for 5 or 10 years. They come back. Nobody knows who they are. So I hired all these young South African actors to recreate the journey and introduce them to the living people who could tell them the stories, or their families. And so, the film actually moves between, and it's not the kind of historical account from the horse's mouth, but also these young, many times just first-time actors recreating, and it's not so much a recreating, but it's like interpreting the lives of people who are their neighbors, and relatives, and also my journey. And so, I am kind of in the middle between the young actors and the older, people of my dad's generation. And then with Through a Lens Darkly, I really wanted something that would be, that would be true to both Deborah Willis's work in terms of, her scholarship around Black photographers. But I also wanted to really make something that was not simply a kind of pat, and I don't want to say PBS documentary. I'm making PBS documentaries. I'm the new PBS documentary. But I wanted to make something that somehow talked about or acknowledged the weight and also the blessing of history in our daily lives. Because it's, we're, 150 years that the film, or 60 years that the film covers is a long time, and it's absolutely nothing.
Right.
From 500 years from now, or 10,000 years from now, it's like, it's the same moment.
That's right.
So I wanted to talk about like that, and it's interesting because we started making the film before, Facebook took hold, and you see how intense these images and the circulation on Facebook, and people, because I went to Harvard, I took African American Studies classes, and I didn't have that. That the awareness of like who's who. The photographers are one thing, but communities. Of diverse classes or people, self-made people. When I was going to school, there was affirmative action. And it was, of course, it was, that was a misnomer because it was actually disrupting affirmative action. Right. But, but it was, you know, it was like, well, why haven't black people pulled themselves up by their bootstraps in the ways, let's say, like Jewish people or Italians or the other immigrant groups? And, you know, it's because of a lack of a understanding of history and an awareness of history that we can create and perpetuate myths that then are used to further disenfranchise people. And so that's an important part of my project as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way to lead me into asking you about narrative, because I think that all that has to do with the way that you construct narrative, or the different ways in which you approach constructing narrative, and the layers of meaning with these narratives. I mean, there's, to me, when you're merging filmmaking and documentary and, you know, just more conceptual ideas with image making, you bring in, your work plays with this kind of fact and fiction, and it's really in that space, kind of in between, you know, what's real and then what's kind of created in the mind, or created through emotion, or created through nostalgia and memory, you know, and who's telling the story. Then authorship comes up, right? So I like to hear you talk about how you know, bring in all these different narrative forms. You know, you talked about documentary, and you talked about the dramatizations or the reenactments that occur within the documentary, which is another element, and having someone else tell the story of someone else. If you could just speak a little bit about how those narrative forms come through in your work, or how you allow for those narrative forms to come through, or you know, what is the impulse for working in that way, for even opening yourself up to all these different narrative forms?
Well, I think that I mean, I've always embraced, like within the film world, a kind of an experimental identity, you know, which goes hand in hand with, you know, working, you know, as an artist within you know, the realm of documentary film, or film in general. I'm not sure, you know, but it's you know, so I think that I use whatever I need to serve the larger project. The end product is in some ways an outcome or outgrowth of the process, and it's really about the process. And I think part of the process is a kind of a self-awareness and a journey that I have to take from one place to another place. Like where I start any particular project and where I end it is I'm a different person. And you know, and so I mean, it means that sometimes they take a little longer, but there's an awareness. There is synchronicity. There is this chance, which is synchronicity, and there's, like, you know, a certain sense of sacrifice. I mean, you know, I really struggled with this last film, whether or not to put myself in it or not, and you know, and now it's become clear that how could I even thought not to put myself in it? You know, and another part of it is performance. You know, I actually taught performance for several years at UCSD, and you know, in the visual arts department, and I did a lot of performance in the early '90s, late '80s, early '90s, and there's a lot of video stuff that I actually have not foregrounded. Recently, since actually leaving that position, I got tenure there in 2002, and I left actually in 2002 as well, and to move back to New York. I had been living here, taken some time off, but since moving back to New York, I became more of a kind of like a little bit, the performative aspect has not been foregrounded, but if you look at the films, you understand, whether it's like, you know, as simple as my narrative in the films. You know, because when I did performance, I did a lot of it's verbal, but not using words to communicate stories. And so I'm very much aware of, like, you know, that aspect of the performative and thinking, like, you know, in terms of characters,
Right.
and also as in terms of performance and performance art, the awareness of the relationship between the person who is performing and the audience. You know, and leaving the space for the audience to be able to create their narrative and pose their narrative and
Right.
have a dialogue. So their narrative, which is being generated, has a dialogue with this other kind of narrative, and it could shift, you
Right.
know, and yeah, because a lot of the films are also very personal in terms of family. I feel like I look so wet.
No, I can't. From here, I can't
Okay.
tell until you. I don't know what the camera can do.
Okay. So to allow for the narrative of the, you know, the performer and the audience to have this kind of, you know, the call and response.
Right.
You know, it doesn't have to be a literal in cinema. It doesn't have to be a literal call and response, but there is that element of, you know, I am making a sacrifice. I am offering a bit of myself, and people, I mean, they come back, and it makes them reflect, and they have to offer a little bit of themselves to themselves,
Right.
you know, and then, you know, my journey goes this way, and their journey, they know where they know where their journey goes, you know, and where their journey can go, where their journey hasn't, whatever, you know. So, so it has. So I think that that's really important part of the process, and it's a part which is, you know, because you have to, because I'm changing in the course of these films, and trying to bring to bear what that change is about, you know, and
you find out what it is about through the course of
making the film.
That's right. That's right. So this is kind of cyclical,
Yeah.
you know, process that happens. So there's a lot of working within the unknown, you know, until something sort of emerges that you can work with again, and then push to that point of not knowing where it can go. When you were talking about performance and your relationship to the audience, I was thinking about how that's relatable to what you were saying when you became, when you started to work in documentary. You were saying that you needed to create your own audience. How that experience of working in performance lent itself when you were kind of in that quandary of creating your own audience through film. Is there a different way that you perceive audience when you're thinking about performance and when you're thinking about when you have a camera, or when you want to engage a film camera?
Well, I think that, like, when I'm making a film, it's really about the engagement between me and the person who's in front of the camera, or in front of the camera with me, or in front of the camera, you know, with the camera between us. There's that engagement, and that's, and so, you know, maybe the audience is the camera at that time. And so what kind of play, you know, what the perspective of the camera is. When I did performances, live performances, several of them involved video projections, like in front of behind the audience.
Right.
And so there was this tension of, like, well, what's more real? This kind of intimate performance over here, or that the video that's larger, more seductive, but then something's happening behind me. So there was this sense of, I guess a lot of it has to do, and I'm so glad you're really making me hone in on this, is that the idea, and this is something I started working on really intensely in 1992, 93, is the idea of the crossroads. And as that the performance space is the space of the crossroads, where, you know, we could together move to other dimensions and have other kinds of experiences. And I think that, I mean, a lot of Hollywood films use it with the violence, you know, that it's like, you know, this, you know, and, you know, there are not that many films that talk about or that are able to manifest or anchor certain types of love, you know, certain types of, yeah, I would have to say love and, you know, elements of joy, elements of pleasure, which are, you know, which are really, I'm really invested in my films. Beauty, you know, in addition to tragedy, you know, and I'm really interested in a lot of the films like Amy Akata, you know, where we talk, you know, moving across different, like, you know, spaces, you know, artists. I just read somewhere someone saying artists are the most dangerous people because they could you know, they're interacting across the boundaries of society, you know, from the quote unquote elite to the quote unquote, you know, totally marginal. And yeah, so it's and it's important to have that sense of diversity, you know, for me, you know, that we are, you know, allowing for that, right, you know, across so many different realms.
Right.
And to challenge myself, you know, in that way too, you know, because I think that, you know, there's, you know, all of us have a certain resistance to things that are new or change or different, and you know, it's the unknown, you know, and I think that. Speaking of the unknown, I think that, you know, this country has been so invested in black people being unknown for such a long time. And so I think that my work is really about how to know ourselves, you know.
Well, that makes me think about diaspora again, because I think that it is a very complicated term, and it's a complicated term that I feel like oftentimes gets maybe a very superficial. There are many superficial associations with it. I think it's a complex thing, and I think it's a complex thing because it's so systemic. You know, it's about sort of this experience of being transient, of being sort of caught up in this system. It's an invisible system for all intents and purposes, but it has very tangible effects on one's body. You know, on identity, the whole concept of self, and I wonder how film lends itself to being the appropriate medium for engaging with that idea. You know, like, are there properties that are inherent to filmmaking that just kind of speak so well to being able to visualize the diasporic experience?
You know, I feel like film is a very powerful medium. Powerful, very flexible medium. It is, by its nature, diasporic, you know, because it's just traveling. It doesn't, you know, it has a home, but it's also homeless. It's also wandering. But my work doesn't start with the films, you know? Like, even before I filmed with the actors in South Africa, I did like a huge citywide campaign in which I had high school students competing by writing essays, essay competition rather, on history and also on where would they place themselves in a similar situation had they been caught up in a certain historical circumstance. And those people received awards as a result of that. This is 6 months before we filmed, you know, and then several of those folks were either in the film or involved in the film, worked behind the scenes. This film is also, 12 Disciples was also the first film to be shot in Bloemfontein and take over the entire city. Right now people are doing plays around the 12 Disciples. It's been embedded, in terms of their cultural history. With Digital Diaspora, it's really about the relationship between me and that person and their archives, or between setting up a situation where people can have a moment where they can unfold and also celebrate the ancestors. Whether they're whatever they're religious, whatever, celebrate the ancestors and call them forth. And also the absurdity of their situation and the identities that they find themselves, or we find ourselves in, and the sharp curves that our life takes us. And it's it's not the rich or the famous person that we're watching, but it's this person who's made this major, making major impacts on their communities, and it's in the images, just like in Thrillins Darkly. There's so much denial about who we are, but the images are right there and they tell the story.
Right.
And of course, you need shaping, and you need some good writing and a lot of blood to get it through, and have it be something that sustains within a certain TV 90 minutes or theatrical 90 minutes, and that's and to really allow that where the poetry shines, where we're coming out with something that's sculpted, and so it is something that is, these things that because I don't know what it's going to be like when I first start. I'm feeling that, I'm feeling this. I put that feeling that, put this here, put that there. Okay, what are we gonna do with this bot? This blob. And but there's truth in here.
Yeah. It's an honesty. Yeah. I think it's an honesty that that is, it's an uncomfortable. It's a there's been words that keep coming up from artists who we've spoken to, and hearing you speak makes me think about honesty, but then also makes me think about vulnerability, and that's a word that artists have, they keep bringing up. There's sort of this, in being honest, you have to kind of allow for a certain vulnerability as a maker, and because your practice is open to other people, other narratives, other influences, and you want to cull from all that, right? So there has to be some sort of, it seems like you're starting from this very vulnerable place. What do you think about these ideas of vulnerability as, the kind of the impetus for creativity, for a creative approach?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability, one has to make oneself vulnerable to, I would say vulnerable and humble, and maybe it's the humbleness of the, that some of this is me and some of this is just coming through me, and it is one is vulnerable. I think that's being humble and also being vulnerable is really an important part of the process. Otherwise, I could try to make the same film that was a success last time and use the same exact formula and do it like a Hollywood star, and just keep doing it and raking in the money,
How it is that you were, exactly.
Exactly, but this time it's okay, well, the truth in this particular project is leading me in this other direction. I'm not sure where it's going, but I just have to go with it and trust. And so, yeah, and then the vulnerable aspect is also, it's like, do I have the right to speak? Do I have the right to, and also to share, these different processes or these different parts of my families or these different secrets, or to reveal spaces of shame, or to reveal spaces of pride, or pride in the good sense, and but also pride in the bad sense. But so it's and to use do I dare to be a poet and working in film as well, so that it's to create something that's not that is assured and definite, but that's open and has the vulnerability that allows for other people to also. To allow for other people also to be vulnerable in the process, because people feel when someone is vulnerable or makes a sacrifice or allows for something to come forth, and it's an invitation,
right?
So and it's so it is going back to that call and response, I don't want to lecture anybody unless I'm getting paid to.
Right, so you're like a little participation.
Yes.
Nothing like a little participation to energize, creativity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the intellect also.
And I just it's like to say that, it's also with the video I showed you with the I think it was 10 those 10 women from Gowanus houses, that we partnered with on Digital Diaspora. It was the first time we had actually worked in a housing project, and I felt that, I had a certain ambivalence around it. It's like all this the myths, there could be guns, or, but also it's unknown,
right?
Because those people are invisible, and they talked about it themselves, but in terms of the larger culture, but in terms of themselves and their communities, they're not, and so I wanted to come, and so I when all we didn't know how many people were going to show up or who was going to show up, and I realized all these people had showed up. I was like, well, the perfect thing to do is I sketched out the tables weren't like that. They weren't, I sketched out the tables, and we set up a backdrop. I had my team, and working with some cinematographers who are they're up and coming, and no real. I mean, we had maybe some lights, but just had to say, okay, we're gonna it's gonna be fine, and it was exactly as it should have been,
right.
But it was it was crafted right on the spot. That was the first time we had done that particular kind of photo sharing, so it was very different from some of the other stuff that we have done, both in people's homes or other museums or different other centers or whatever. It was it was a whole different kind of modality, by having this kind of discussion space. So it wasn't simply people were sharing with me. I was asking them questions, but they were also telling a community, sharing with a community that knew some of the stories, because they were their neighbors and friends, and so they could actually, intersect with the stories in interesting ways, whether it's a laugh or acknowledgement, or when their turn came to tell the story, from the 7-year-old to the 85, 87-year-old, who had raised the kids of most of these women, through this other community engagement project. And so it was, so it's a real, I would love for you to see the rest of that, that project, because, it's really an important, for me, it's an important project.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, I think it also speaks volumes to sort of where you are now when you're thinking about the medium, and still carrying on a lot of the seeds that were planted early on, and being a filmmaker and using film, right? But it's evolved into this sort of collective space. When you speak about the women, you call them partners. So your language also is taking on this sense of the collective as well. And so I wonder how the collective plays a part in how you're thinking about film or documentary now.
Yeah, I mean, all of my films have been really collective endeavors. I mean, they've been, meeting people along the way. In the Brazil film, I met people along the way who became the associate producers in the journey. And so with this new space of this kind of like digital diaspora family reunion, both the roadshow and also particularly the roadshow, because that's part of the roadshow. It's quite moving, quite touching, because not only are people like revealing and sharing, their material, but also they're becoming, by working with me, they're becoming part of digital diaspora and part of a larger community of people who've actually done the same or similar kinds of things, and they're reaching out to one another beyond. So that is a real, it's unexpected. I'm done. I don't know what else to say. I don't know what to say.
Okay.
No, I don't have to be done, but I maybe I need to stay a little bit more water.
Let's talk about social media, Facebook. And so naturally that makes me think about the proliferation of images that are available now in the contemporary moment. And, there's this, preciousness of the image that I hear you speak about. But now there's also this kind of pedestrian association with image making. Images are everywhere. And so it just seems like people don't think about, consciously perhaps, the power of images so much anymore in the way, when it was more of a precious experience, because they proliferate. You're sharing images all the time. I wonder how you incorporate this, the proliferation of images, the fact that there's so many images, into how you're thinking about making films now, or your projects, your film projects.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of what my new films are about is the family photographic album, right? And it also goes back, way back in terms of my family and stuff, because a lot of my material comes from my family album early on. And it is true that there is this proliferation of images. I don't know if people are more critical or aware or even more visually literate, because there's so many images, or, I think that people assume certain things. There was a lot of discussion recently about light skin versus dark skin African American community, what's valued, and what images are being seen in popular culture more often. And it's come to me via Twitter several times, and not so much about on a one-to-one basis, but okay, what images are we seeing? What is glorified? Whether it's the music videos, the films, boom, boom, boom. It's like, okay, what are we seeing? And so I think that to a certain degree, people are sensitive still, but there's not like a real sense of visual literacy. And just going back to the family album, I was sharing a version of the film with an intern, and she said, and she's like, maybe 19, 20, 21, and she says, I don't have a family album. We don't have family albums. archives. We don't have, they don't, these things, they're all on, here or on our computers or our hard drive or a Facebook, and so it's like, okay, well, how do we begin to think about the archive? In terms of telling a story. I recently updated the timeline of Facebook. I'm like one of the last people to do it.
It forced you.
It forced me, yes. and I was like, and I look back to when I first started Facebook in 2008. I was like, oh wow, I remember that moment. And it's like it has a certain narrative, a narrative that I put up there, And I was like, okay, well, where else is my narrative? Where else is my narrative? And where else can I construct my narrative? What other tools? Of course, I keep, I lost about 9 months of images at one point. It's a horrible story. But I lost 9 months of images. It's like I lost 9 months of my life. It's like, where is it?
But there again is the power of images, right? Where I don't have those 9 months of documented work, documented images anymore.
And they're even thinking, well, what was in those 9 months? What what images were they again? Right. And so and anytime an image is missing, was it during the 9 months? It goes back to that hole. Right. So so it's a really, I think that, part of my mission with Digital Diaspora is to encourage people to preserve and protect the archives and think about them as valuable as the New York Times thinks about its archives. And so we actually try to give everybody a DVD after we scan their images, so that they have, and of the people that we've interviewed, and Digital Diaspora is actually open to all people. It's not exclusive to African Americans, but it is, we really try to foreground African Americans because, we are the digital divide. Right. Out of maybe, let's say if we interviewed 100 people, we've actually interviewed more than 100 people, we've interviewed 100 people, I would say maybe about 95 might have had this, 95%. Don't have any digital images of their archives.
So it's especially necessary.
Yeah.
In that regard.
Yeah. So in a lot of the images we see on Facebook or circulating on the web are images that might come from an archive, like a lot of now are coming out of Yale. That has an open archive, or some might come from the Schomburg. I'm not sure if you could download those, but there's certain places you can download these images, and a lot of them are celebrity African Americans. So that image is Billie Holiday, or a famous, usually actor, as opposed to like a cultural leader or labor leader, or even an artist, that works, in the plastic arts, or filmmaker or whatever, Oscar Michaud. So many people don't know that image as much as, the more performer, music performer image, jazz usually, or blues, or pop, or movies. And then the other images are images of unknown African Americans, that you don't know any of the stories. And so we're kind of in between, because we're trying to actually get the stories and get people to tag and understand what that's about. And I'm working on a narrative project as well that actually is informed a lot by documentary. It's one of the next slate of the next projects. So I feel like the form of documentary is such a potent form, even if it's that's something I'm going to continue working with, and I know that's not part of this question, but I thought I'd try
to.
Exactly.
The final question. So generosity is something that's really important to me as a part of thinking about social engagement, working with people, and creating spaces to exchange and interact with people. And I'm thinking about generosity as either something that is produced through a process, or as an organizing principle.
Uh-huh.
So my question to you is, how do you see generosity or generousness working within your practice?
Oh, generosity is like, so much a part of my practice. I mean, I think that for me, generosity is, thinking or embracing, people that we meet and come across as part of, the best part of what family means. That I could give of myself, give of my time, of my spirit, and because I'm asking them to do the same, and together, that then opens things up. But yeah, I think that generosity is. I think it's important to think about generosity outside of the dollar or the euro or the rice, any kind of monetary, because I think that generosity at its root is really, spirit, where is your generosity located, and I prefer my generosity to be located in my heart, in my mind, and because I have to start there, before it ever gets, to the pocketbook. That's or right. Whatever,
Or it takes any other form.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's that's important, and it starts at home, as well, So
that is it. We're done.
I have to go take a